The history of the Back to the Future games. There's no doubt that Back to the Future is an iconic and legendary film series. Robert Zemeckis' 80s sci-fi classic has endured as a cinematic favorite for many people and has even inspired some more recent media. If you're a Back to the Future fan and think the characters are Rick and Morty look more than a little familiar, you're on the right track. But that's not the only connection these gems from the 80s have with modern movies. What if I told you that Back to the Future and the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie have something in common? No, it's not flying cars, and no, it's not talking trees. The connection these movies share relates to one of the actors and another film they starred in. Stick around for the answer to the awesome piece of trivia at the end of this video. For right now, we can get down to business and start discussing what this video is really about. If you grew up around the Back to the Future, you probably wanted to go on adventures with Doc and Marty just like I did. Thankfully, there have been several Back to the Future video games that allow you to do just that, although not all of them were as good as the movies. Anyways, let's dig into the good and the bad in today's video, the history of the Back to the Future video games. Back to the Future for the NES. One fateful day in 1989, I came across Back to the Future for the NES at my local video store. As a huge fan of the first two movies then and even now, I knew I had to rent it. I remember seeing the box art for the game and thinking that this would be the best game I had ever played in my young life. The night I rented the game also happened to be a night I was having a sleepover with one of my friends, so we would both be able to experience the awesomeness of video game based on one of our favorite movies. Unfortunately, this would never be possible as the game is designed more like an endless runner style game rather than an open world one. I would have preferred if the game was more like an RPG in which the player would need to find Marty's young mom, Lorraine Baines, and young dad George McFly in order to set them up for the school dance just like the movie. Going back to Back to the Future for the NES as an adult, the game doesn't seem as bad as I remember it. I actually quite appreciate the game now for what it is, and the levels are definitely easier to complete as an adult than they were when I was a kid. I do have a few decades of set gamer skills under my belt now, though. Well, every level except Lou's Cafe. That one's still crazy hard.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more! Where the are your parents? Who are your parents? I'm gonna call Child Protective Services. It's time to stop!
But at least you actually get to drive the DeLorean. That's one of the coolest parts of this game. Right now, I own 2 copies of Back to the Future for the NES. I was lucky enough to come across a seller on eBay who is selling 2 for the price of 1, as he just wanted to get rid of them. So I have 1 copy that I play and 1 copy tucked away safely as a backup. Back to the Future 2 for the Super Famicom. There were other versions of video game adaptations of Back to the Future 2, but the one that I prefer was released on July 13, 1993, 4 years after the movie it was based on. It's Back to the Future 2 for the Super Famicom, and was actually only ever released in Japan. The version I played was the English translated version, except that that's not really how it went down. Back to the Future for the NES isn't as terrible as something like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure for the NES, but it definitely wasn't a good game either. It forces you to go around collecting clocks and throwing bowling balls at enemies instead of doing what I really wanted to do, explore a hill valley at my own pace. Since this game was only intended for Japan, it is really Japanese. All of the characters in the game look like anime versions of the movie characters. For instance, just look at how cute Chibi Marty is, and how imposing anime Biff is. He looks like he came right out of Kill la Kill. Back to the Future 2 for the Super Famicom is a side-scrolling, platforming adventure game where the player takes control of Marty, and uses his hoverboard to zoom through levels, smash into bad guys, and bounce off their heads like Sonic the Hedgehog. In fact, much of this version of Back to the Future 2's game design is similar to the Sonic games. You never travel as fast as Sonic, but you pick up speed to fly through multi-layered levels and use the occasional elevator lift to reach new areas. Marty even steps off his board and does a little animation just like Sonic at the end of every stage. I really enjoy Back to the Future 2 on the Super Famicom. The level design, the interpretation of the characters, all of it just so unique and endearing. As an added bonus, you also get to hear the instantly recognizable Back to the Future orchestral music, unlike the NES game, which doesn't have that music at all. Back to the Future for modern-day consoles and PC. After that Japan-only romp in the Back to the Future universe, there was nothing in terms of Back to the Future video games for 17 years. People were born, grew up, and could probably drive a car in the time Back to the Future fans were waiting for a new game. And unfortunately, what they got was probably not what many were expecting. Throughout the mid to late 2000s, Telltale Games developed a name for themselves and a reputation for their narrative adventure games based on properties like Sam & Max, Bone, CSI, and even Wallace and Gromit. Eventually, they grew to a size where they could take on bigger properties, and the first game they made based on that big movie was Back to the Future, the game in 2010. You're probably familiar with Telltale Games for their Walking Dead titles, and Back to the Future plays much the same. It tells an original story that serves as a sequel to the original trilogy over 5 episodes that each take roughly an hour to complete. Players make decisions throughout the game and in conversations that ultimately affect how that story plays out. So it's definitely different from the other Back to the Future games, and isn't the kind of action-adventure game fans like me might have liked, but it's still pretty cool and it has a great story. If you had never heard of this game before now and are excited to try it out, there is a bit of bad news. You can't really get it digitally on Xbox or PlayStation anymore. The game has been delisted from those marketplaces, but you can get it on the PC still. It was a free game for Xbox Live subscribers at some point in the past, which is how I got it, and I'm really glad I have it in my collection as a Back to the Future fan. Dishonorable mention. You might have noticed that out of the many Back to the Future games that have been available over the years, I only talked about 3 of them. That's because most of them are different versions of the same game made for different consoles, and most of those were just flat out bad. So, to round out this video, I'll be giving a dishonorable mention to Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 for the NES, which I consider to be the worst Back to the Future game of them all. If my memory is correct, I received this game for Christmas 1990 after my mother ordered it on QVC. That channel is known for being highly skilled at selling people crap, and this was definitely one of those times. The game's publisher, LGN, did everything they could to make you think the game they were selling would be awesome. They created an awesome looking cover and knew just how to market it to sell to unsuspecting buyers. We didn't have the internet back then, so access to early reviews and Twitter opinions couldn't have saved me at the time. The game was essentially a ripoff of the Super Mario Bros. Games that were popular at the time, but much more bland and boring than the games it tried to copy. It was advertised as taking you through the second and third movies in the series, but the actual game seemed to have a little to do with either movie and was even nonsensical at times. Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 is so bad, it makes LGN's first Back to the Future game look like an absolute masterpiece by comparison. I wanted to love this game, but it just wasn't fun to play. Instead of keeping it in my collection, I sold it to a retro game store in order to buy an NES game I actually did like, and I don't ever regret that decision. Final thoughts. And that's about it for the Back to the Future games. While we haven't gotten an awesome open world game in the universe like Mad Max on the PS4, the Telltale Back to the Future game is still pretty fun to play. I'm still holding out for an awesome game where you drive the DeLorean around freely and explore different time periods, but I know that might never happen. Remember, if you wanted to get your hands on Back to the Future, the game, You can't get it digitally on consoles, and a physical copy will be crazy expensive to buy. I'd recommend buying the digital version on PC if you really want to play it. That's all for today. See you next time. Ha! You thought I forgot about the little piece of trivia from the beginning, didn't you? If you don't know the answer to it already, here's how Back to the Future and Guardians of the Galaxy are connected. In 1985's Back to the Future, Leah Thompson plays Lorraine Baines, the mother of Marty McFly. A year later, in 1986, she also starred in a little film that has been mostly lost to time, called Howard the Duck. That tiny duck detective is a character from the Marvel Universe, and also made a brief appearance in a stinger scene for the first Guardians of the Galaxy, where he was voiced by Seth Green. Furthermore, while I did not enjoy Bill and Ted's excellent adventure NES game, others, such as my friend Mr. Postel, did, and I would recommend checking it out if you're curious about how the game is. What a tangled web. That's a pretty cool connection, right? I hope you enjoyed it. And for real this time. That's all I have for you, and I'll see you in the next video. And remember, gaming is your road to adventure.